Did I answer your question?
What are your feelings towards the detectives and the police who are involved in your case?
Great question. It is funny. So I never really. I remember one instance when like a couple of detectives came to my bedside and asked me a series of questions about what happened to me, and they told me, one of them said to me, "We're going to find this guy. Don't you worry." In that kind of tough cop way, "We're going to find this guy who did this to you." And then I never saw those detectives again. And again, it's one of those things. New York City was such a violent place. My neighborhood was such a violent place that I think that what happened to me, because I didn't die, it wasn't a gang-related shooting. I think they had so many other cases on their plate that, they couldn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out, who randomly shot this kid. So I don't hold any regrets. I imagine they did the best they could. I often joke, but I often say if it was a rich kid that it happened to, or if it was a politician's son, they probably would have put in more effort. But the reality was, I was the son of a single mother. I looked like every other kid as possible. I'm sure they may have thought, maybe he was in trouble with gangs or something. So they didn't spend a lot of time. But I don't hold any regrets. I think that they probably did the best they could. Also, they were trying to find a needle in a haystack, I believe. So I don't hold any regrets. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, did you like have a time budget? Did you budget your time for when you worked on the book? Like, did you say, I'm going to work this many hours and this time? So what was it?
Okay. Great question. Did I have a time budget when I worked on this book? It's funny you should ask that. When I first started working on this book, it was after I graduated from grad school. I went to school to be a teacher years later. And I graduated from grad school. And at the time, this was a good 3 or 4 years ago, and I was actually living in Portland. It was the first time I ever moved to Portland. And I did my student teaching, actually, at Jefferson High School. And after my student teaching was done, I couldn't get a job because Portland Public Schools wasn't hiring. I applied here. I thought, hey, I came to visit this school and thought it was like a very cool school, and I applied here. But at the time, nobody was hiring. And so I was sitting at home all day, kind of, not doing a lot, not accomplishing a lot. And I thought, well, I could either spend this time constructively and work on something, or I could just kind of hang around and send out resumes and kind of be bummed that I can't find a job. And so I decided I'm going to work on this book. People had told me throughout so much of my life, people said, wow, your story is interesting. I bet if you wrote it down, people might want to read it. And so I started writing this book, and actually, because I didn't have a job, I had about a good, 6 hours in the afternoon, like from the moment I woke up. And so I set this time schedule for myself. I said, all right, from about 9 to 1, I'm going to write. I had this whole thing where I would watch the Today Show in the morning, and then I was over at 9 o'clock, I would write. So I would write from 9 to 1, and then take the rest of the day and go do something like go to a movie or maybe visit with friends or something. But that was my schedule for myself, and I actually did a very good job of sticking to that schedule. But the first time I wrote the book, I wrote it in a very different way than what you see now. I was actually writing a much longer kind of autobiography, and it was way too long. And so I came up with the idea later on to address it to Marcus, this guy who I call Marcus. Even though I never know who he was, I decided to call him Marcus, the guy who shot me. And once I came up with that idea, it took me 2 months. It was such an inspiring idea that I just ran with it, and it really took me 2 months. So about 2 months of writing about 3 to 4 hours a day, and I was done. I went back and made like little edits later on, but for the most part, it took me about a good 2 to 3 months once I got it down. But I'm a firm believer in setting a schedule for yourself. That's one thing that I really strongly believe. I wanted that discipline of setting a schedule. To answer your question? Yes.
So you said you were with your friend when you got shot. What happened? What do you think would have happened if your friend got shot?
So she's asking a very good question. I was with my friend, and what would have happened? She's asking what would have happened if my friend got shot instead of me. which is one of the most popular questions I get, and it's one of those questions that I have no idea what the answer is to it, but it's amazing to sit and think about it. It's one of those like what ifs that you'll never really be able to answer in life, but it is kind of fascinating to think about. I'll tell you this. I was with a circle. There were like 4 of us who were tight. We were all like brothers. There was a guy named Eric who I was with that night. There was my friend Lamont, who was with us that night. And there was my friend Dean. And Dean and Lamont wound up spending the night in Greenwich Village that night, where I was coming from, the place where a lot of the wealthy kids I knew lived. And then Eric and I walked home. And Eric and I, we were very, very close. But after my accident, after the shooting, I saw him maybe twice, and then never saw him again. Now keep in mind, we were 13 years old. So I think, I don't blame him. It's very hard, I think, when you're that young to process a trauma and a tragedy that happens to your friend. I think, it was very difficult for him. I know for a fact it was difficult for a lot of my friends to stay in touch with me because it was such a horrible thing to see your best friend lying in a bed with tubes attached to him, unable to move, not knowing, what his life is going to be like. But I will tell you this, I learned from good friends of mine that Eric went on to lead a life of drugs. He was in and out of drug rehab centers a lot. And actually, it's a funny question because a lot of my friends at that time period wound up leading kind of dark, difficult lives. A lot of them got involved with drugs. My friend Lamont, who again was like a brother to me, wound up dying of a drug overdose years later at a very young age. My friend Dean wound up becoming involved heavily in drugs. And so it almost asks the question, what if this didn't happen to you? If you weren't shot, would you have gone down that kind of dark and disturbing path like a lot of your friends? And so it's funny. It asks the question, like, was this a blessing in disguise, if you will? Which, again, I'll never be able to answer. I like to think that I was such a positive kid, that I had such a good attitude that I would not have allowed myself to get involved in drugs, and that I would have seen the ridiculousness of that lifestyle and not gone that way. But who knows? But it's funny, I spent a long time asking myself, or just wondering, what if Eric had been standing on the left side of the street and I had been standing on the right side of the street? It's just one of those things I'll never know, but it's a fascinating question. It's a question that'll probably stay with me forever. Yeah.
What was your mother's reaction to the accident?
Okay, so what was my mother's reaction to the accident? It's funny because, as I told you, I was defying her rules when she wanted me to come home that night. And I had basically pushed her rules back, and I had basically gotten to that point in my life where I said, I'm going to kind of do what I want to do. My mother's not going to have that much control. In that kind of very disrespectful young boy way, I thought, hey, I know what's best for me, and I'm going to start to do what I want to do. And I remember being in the ambulance that night, driving to the hospital, and one of the first things I was thinking was, wow, my mother's going to be so angry when she gets to the hospital. And I remember actually thinking to myself, this is not going to be pleasant. Like, I didn't want to see her.